Commander Zixara had seen many species in her 3 decades of service aboard the Celestial Harmony, but none quite like the human who sat quietly in the corner of the diplomatic lounge. Marcus Chen appeared unremarkable by most galactic standards. Average height, no natural armor plating, no venomous sacs, no electromagnetic sensing organs. His skin looked paper-thin compared to her own chitinous exoskeleton. Are you certain this creature can handle the negotiations on Kepler 442b? She asked Ambassador Velthak, her mandibles clicking with concern. The gravity there is 2.3 times standard. The atmospheric pressure could crush most soft-bodied species. The Threnody ambassador's gill slits fluttered, their equivalent of laughter. The humans insisted on sending one of their own. Something about representation. Personally, I give him 3 hours before he requires medical evacuation. Marcus looked up from his tablet, offering a polite smile. I appreciate the concern, but I'll be fine. Earth's gravity is actually pretty close to Kepler 442b's. Zixara's compound eyes widened. Earth? That death world? She'd heard whispers about the human homeworld, a planet so hostile that most civilized species considered it uninhabitable. Tectonic activity, predators, weather patterns that could kill, and worst of all, the inhabitants actually thrived there. Just Earth, Marcus said with that strange human expression they called a shrug. 3 hours later, the diplomatic shuttle shuddered as it broke through Kepler 442b's dense atmosphere. The Javari delegates, encased in their environmental suits, moved with obvious strain despite their mechanical assistance. Zixara felt the pressure through her reinforced carapace, each step requiring conscious effort. Marcus walked beside them in nothing but his standard diplomatic attire, breathing the planet's thick atmosphere as if it were perfectly normal. Impossible, muttered Velthak through his suit's comm system. How is he not collapsing? The human's only concession to the environment was a slight adjustment in his walking pace. Not slower, but more deliberate, as if he were simply taking a pleasant stroll through a park. The negotiations themselves went poorly from the start. The Javari were desperate. Their mining colony on the planet's northern continent had been cut off for 6 days after a massive seismic event. Traditional rescue equipment couldn't penetrate the unstable cavern system without risking total collapse. They needed the Galactic Coalition's most advanced rescue technology, but the bureaucratic process would take weeks. 17 miners trapped beneath 200 meters of unstable rock. The lead Javari negotiator wheezed through her environmental suit. Our deep-bore rescue units are too heavy. Any vibration could cause a complete cave-in. Zixara studied the geological surveys. Even our most advanced equipment would require at least a week to establish a safe extraction corridor. The probability of the trapped miners surviving that long is approximately 12%, Velthak finished grimly. Marcus had been silent through most of the technical discussions, but now he stood and walked to the holographic display showing the collapsed mine. His fingers moved across the projected surface, tracing pathways through the debris field. What if someone went in manually? He asked quietly. The room fell silent except for the hum of life support systems. Manually? Zixara's translator struggled with the concept. No being could survive crawling through those passages. The air pockets are barely large enough for a maintenance drone, and the structural integrity. I volunteer. The declaration hung in the air like a physical object. Velthak's gill slits snapped shut in shock. The Javari delegates stared at the human as if he'd just offered to swallow a star. Absolutely not, Zixara said firmly. It would be suicide. The passages are narrow, unstable, and any significant disturbance could kill everyone, including the trapped miners. Marcus was already moving toward the exit. How long do we have? Human, this is madness, Velthak protested, following after him. Your species may be resilient, but you're still organic. Carbon-based, fragile. Marcus paused at the doorway and turned back. For the first time since they'd met, Zixara saw something in his eyes that made her take an involuntary step backward. It wasn't aggression or anger. It was absolute, unshakable determination. 17 people are going to die if someone doesn't try, he said simply. 2 hours later, Zixara watched through the rescue team's external cameras as Marcus disappeared into a gap in the collapsed mine that her own arm couldn't have fit through. He'd stripped down to basic clothing and carried nothing but a comm unit, a small light, and the emergency medical kit. Passage clear for the first 30 meters, his voice crackled through the comm, moving deeper. For the next 6 hours, they tracked his progress through seismic sensors and his intermittent communications. He crawled through spaces that would have been impossibly tight for any other species they knew, squeezed past jagged metal that should have shredded him, and navigated by touch through areas where the thermal imaging showed crushing pressure from unstable ceiling supports. Contact, Marcus finally reported, his voice strained but steady. I've reached the trapped miners. 17 confirmed alive, but 3 need immediate medical attention. What followed was a feat that would be spoken of in the Coalition archives for generations. One by one, Marcus carried the injured miners back through the same impossible passages, his human physiology somehow allowing him to maneuver in spaces that defied logic. When the injured were safe, he returned for the others, making trip after trip through the unstable cavern system. How? Zixara whispered as they watched the 15th miner emerge from the rescue shaft, carried in Marcus's arms like a child. How is this possible? The human finally emerged just as the morning sun crested the horizon, his clothes torn and his skin covered in abrasions, but his eyes still held that same quiet determination. He set the last miner down gently and swayed slightly on his feet. 17, he said simply, then collapsed. As the medical teams rushed to treat both the rescued miners and their unlikely savior, Velthak approached Zixara with something approaching reverence in his movements. I think, he said quietly, we've been fundamentally misunderstanding what fragile means when applied to humans. Zixara watched as Marcus was loaded onto a medical transport, already arguing with the medics about not needing treatment. Perhaps, she agreed, we should reconsider our definition of fragile entirely. The negotiations resumed the next day with a very different tone. Marcus, sporting bandages and walking with a slight limp, was offered the seat of honor at the table. The Javari had already drafted a preliminary trade agreement that exceeded the Coalition's most optimistic projections. Tell me, the lead Javari negotiator asked as they concluded the formal proceedings, is this normal? For humans? Marcus considered the question seriously. Honestly? Pretty much. We don't really have a choice but to be stubborn. Our planet taught us that giving up isn't an option. As the shuttle lifted off from Kepler 442b, Zixara found herself looking at humanity's place in the galaxy with entirely new eyes. They weren't the fragile newcomers she'd assumed them to be. They were something far more dangerous and valuable. They were beings who simply refused to accept that something couldn't be done. The human sat quietly in the corner again, already reading reports about their next diplomatic mission, but now Zixara understood what she was really looking at. A member of a species that had turned survival on a death world into an art form. And that, she realized, made them perhaps the most powerful allies the galaxy had ever seen.